He just wanted his daughter to feel a flicker of magic in a world that had gone dim. A single raffle ticket bought with the last of his grocery money was a long shot. A prayer whispered into the noise of the town fair he never expected to win. And he certainly never expected the prize to be a private dinner with a mysterious billionaire who seemed to know every scar on his heart before he even showed her where they were. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a private dinner with a mysterious billionaire. Comment: where in the world are you watching from the air? In Leo's workshop, smelled of cedar sawdust and the faint metallic tang of unpaid bills. Rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the tin roof, each drop a tiny reminder of the leak he'd been meaning to fix for a month. A patch of dark dampness stained the ceiling above a half-finished rocking horse, its gentle curves sanded smooth, but its spirit still trapped in the wood. Like so many of his own hopes, Leo stood at his pine workbench, one hand resting on the smooth grain of the wood, the other wrapped around a mug of instant coffee that had long gone cold. He stared out the grimy window at the gray wash of the morning. A sky, the color of forgotten promises it was. His daughter Maya's 8th birthday next week, and the thought sat in his chest like a stone. He had $64 in the bank, an eviction notice folded neatly in the junk drawer, and a collection of custom furniture orders that had been canceled. One by one, as the town's economy tightened its grip. He was a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands, who found truth in the honesty of wood. But you couldn't pay rent with truth. And you couldn't buy a birthday cake. With the scent of pine, he took a slow sip of the cold coffee, the bitterness, a familiar companion. He could still hear his wife's voice in the quiet corners of the shop, telling him that his hands could build anything, that his heart was as steady as the oak he loved to work with. But her voice had been gone for 2 years now, and the silence she left behind was a hollow ache that some days felt too big to carry alone. Maya's laughter from the small apartment above the workshop cut through his thoughts, a sound so bright and pure it almost hurt. She didn't know about the notices or the canceled orders or the way he sometimes skipped meals so she could have a little extra in her lunchbox to her. The person-spermant world was still a place of wonder, a place where her dad could fix anything with a bit of wood glue and a patient smile. He didn't want that wonder to fade. Not yet. He couldn't let it. He finished the coffee and set the mug down with a quiet clink. His eyes landed on a small, intricate jewelry box. He'd started for his wife before she got sick. Its lid was inlaid with a tiny mother-of-pearl star, something he'd spent weeks perfecting. He hadn't touched it since she passed. It felt too much like trying to hold on to a ghost, but now he looked at it and saw Maya's face, her eyes wide with the same light his wife used to have. Maybe he thought, maybe he could finish it for her. It wasn't a bike, or a fancy doll. But it was something made of love. Something that would last, and for a man with nothing else to give, love had to be enough. The town fair was a burst of color and sound against the bleakness of the weak strings of colored lights were strung between lampposts. The scent of kettle corn and fried dough hung heavy in the air, and the cheerful noise of a carousel organ drifted from the center of the town square. Leo held Maya's hand tightly as they walked, his knuckles white, his jaw set. He hadn't wanted to come. He knew he couldn't afford any of the rides or the games or the brightly colored sweets. But Maya had seen the flyer at school, and her eyes had lit up with a hope he couldn't bring himself to extinguish. So here they were, walking through a world of things they couldn't have, a father and daughter holding on to each other like they were the only two solid things in a spinning universe. Maya tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward a mobile small booth, draped in blue and gold fabric. A sign handwritten in looping cursive read, "Community Center Fundraiser. A chance to win a night of a lifetime." Below it, a list of prizes was tacked to a board. A gift basket from the port, local bakery, a handmade quilt, and at the very bottom in bold letters, a grand prize that made Leo's brow furrow, a private dinner with our town's mysterious benefactor. Who the hell was that, he muttered to himself. Maya wasn't reading the fine print. She was staring at the quilt. A beautiful patchwork of stars and moons that looked like something out of a storybook. "Daddy, can we try?" she asked, her voice small and full of longing. Leo looked down at her, then, at the price on the sign, 1 ticket for $5. $5 was half a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. It was gas to get to the one job prospect he had lined up for Monday. It was a stupid risk, a foolish waste. But then he looked at Maya's face again, at the unwavering belief in her eyes, that magic was still possible, and his resolve crumbled. He pulled the worn leather wallet from his back pocket, the one his wife had given him for their last anniversary, and took out the single $10 bill tucked inside. He walked to the booth, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "1 ticket, please," he said to the woman behind the counter, his voice rougher than he intended. She smiled a kind, tired smile and handed him a small blue ticket. He held it out to Maya. "You pick the number, kiddo." "You've got the magic touch." She took it, with the reverence of a sacred object, her little fingers tracing the blank line before she scribbled a number with a crayon she pulled from her pocket. She folded the ticket carefully and dropped it into the large glass bowl filled with hundreds of others, a tiny blue speck in a sea of chances, as they walked away. Leo didn't look back. He knew it was a waste. He knew they wouldn't win. But for one brief moment, as Maya squeezed his hand, her face bright with the thrill of possibility, it almost felt worth it. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Leo was trying to coax a stubborn joint into place on an old rocking chair. He was fixing for a neighbor. The phone buzzed against the workbench, rattling with a sound that made his stomach clench. He expected it to be the landlord or another client calling to cancel, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, polished and professional. "Is this Leo Morgan?" she asked. "Speaking," he said cautiously. "This is Sarah, from the Cedar Creek Community Council. I'm calling to congratulate you. Your raffle ticket was chosen for the grand prize." Leo froze, the chisel in his hand slipping slightly. He stared at the wall, his mind struggling to catch up. "The grand prize," he repeated dumbly. "Yes, the dinner with our benefactor. It's scheduled for this Saturday at 7 p.m. at the old Vance estate, on the hill. A car will be sent to pick you up." The Vance estate. Leo's blood ran cold. The place was a local legend, a sprawling stone mansion that had sat empty for years, a monument to a fortune made somewhere else by someone the town had never seen. People whispered it was haunted, that a reclusive billionaire lived there like a ghost, surrounded by gates and silence. "Is this a joke?" he asked. The woman laughed, a soft, polite sound. "Not at all, Mr. Morgan. You and your daughter are our guests of honor. We'll send a confirmation email with all the details." The line clicked dead. Leo stood there for a long time, the phone still pressed to his ear. The silence in the workshop felt different now, heavier charged, with a disbelief that was so potent it was almost painful. He had won. He had actually won a dinner at a place he'd only ever heard about in whispers. A dinner with a person who didn't even have a name, just a title. He sank onto a nearby stool and ran a hand through his hair. What was he supposed to do? Wear his one good shirt, the one with the collar that was starting to fray. What were they supposed to talk about? The price of lumber? The art of dovetail joints? His stomach twisted into a knot of anxiety and pride. He was a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands. Not someone who attended fancy dinners in stone mansions, but then he thought of Maya, her face, when he would tell her her unwavering belief that he had the magic touch. He couldn't take that away from her, no matter how terrified he was. He stood up and walked to the small dusty mirror hanging by the door. He looked at his reflection, at the tired lines around his eyes, the sawdust in his hair. The man staring back at him was not the kind of man who belonged in a billionaire's world. But for one night, for Maya, he would have to pretend he was Saturday. Arrived with a sky, the color of a pale bruise, soft and uncertain. Leo spent the afternoon in a state of quiet panic. He'd patched the clad elbow of his best jacket with a piece of dark fabric he'd found in his wife's old sewing kit and pressed his shirt using a damp towel and the bottom of a hot pan. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could do. He helped Maya get ready. She wore a simple navy blue dress he'd found at a thrift store. Last year its hem was a little short now, but she didn't seem to notice. She twirled in front of the small cracked mirror in her room, her hair brushed and shining, her eyes sparkling with an excitement that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. She looked like a princess, and he felt like an imposter. The car arrived at precisely 6:45. It wasn't a flashy limousine, but a sleek black sedan so quiet it seemed to glide up to the curb rather than drive the driver. A man in a crisp suit stepped out and opened the back door without a word. Leo took a deep breath, held Maya's hand, and slid inside. The interior smelled of leather and something clean and expensive that Leo couldn't name. The ride to the Vance estate was silent. They wound their way up the hill, leaving the familiar lights of the town behind them until they were surrounded by dark woods and the imposing shadows of ancient trees. The gates to the estate were massive wrought iron giants that swung open silently. As they approached, the mansion itself was even more intimidating than the legends suggested. It was a sprawling fortress of dark stone and ivy-covered walls with tall, narrow windows that glowed with a cold, unwelcoming light. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a museum for secrets. The driver led them to a pair of towering oak doors and opened one for them. Entrance hall was vast and silent. Their footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor, a cathedral of wealth and emptiness. A woman, in a severe black dress, greeted them with a polite nod. "Mr. Morgan, Miss Morgan, our host is waiting for you. This way." She led them through a series of long corridors lined with paintings that were probably worth more than Leo's entire workshop. The air was still and cool, and the only sound was the distant clinking of silverware. Leo's hand tightened around Maya's. He could feel her trembling slightly, not with fear, but with awe. They finally arrived at another set of double doors. The woman pushed them open to reveal a dining room so large it could have hosted a royal wedding. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, set for three with gleaming silver and crystal that reflected the light from a massive chandelier above. At the far end of the table, a figure stood silhouetted against a towering window that overlooked the entire valley. As they stepped closer, the figure turned and the breath caught in Leo's throat. It was a woman. She was tall, elegant, with dark hair, swept back from her face and eyes, the color of a stormy sea. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no pretense, but her presence filled the room with an unspoken power. She wasn't just wealthy, she was commanding. Her gaze met Leo's, and a faint smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm Clara Vance. Welcome to my home." Clara Vance watched them as they approached, her expression a carefully constructed mask of polite hospitality, but behind her calm eyes a storm of curiosity and something else, something akin to recognition, was brewing. She had seen this man before, not in person, but in the quiet observations she'd made from a distance. For months, she had watched the town of Cedar Creek from the isolation of her stone fortress, a place she'd inherited but never called home. She'd learned the rhythms of the community, the faces of its people, the quiet struggles and small triumphs that painted the canvas of their lives. She had seen Leo Morgan at the hardware store, his hands calloused, and sure as he chose a specific type of wood. She'd seen him at the park, pushing Maya on the swings, his laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air, and she'd seen him sitting alone in his workshop, late at night, the single light from his window, a beacon of tireless dedication in a sleeping town. There was an integrity to him, a quiet strength, that she found both baffling and captivating. He was a man who built things that lasted in a world she knew to be disposable. His world was made of wood and sweat, and love hers was made of stock portfolios and silent transactions. When her foundation had proposed the community raffle, she had added the grand prize on a whim, a way to bridge the chasm between her world and theirs, to connect with the town in a way that money alone could not. When she saw Leo's name on the winning ticket, a jolt of something undeniable had gone through her. It felt less like chance and more like fate, pulling a thread she hadn't even realized was loose. Now he stood before her, his posture stiff with pride, his eyes wary, and his daughter a small beacon of light clinging to his hand. He looked exactly as she expected, proud, resilient, and completely out of place in her world. And for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, she wanted to know everything about him. She wanted to understand what it felt like to be a man who had so little but seemed to hold so much. Clara gestured to the chairs. "Please sit," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Leo pulled out a chair for Maya first, a small gesture of protection that did not go unnoticed. Before taking his own seat, at the vast polished table, the space between them felt like a mile. Maya looked around the room, her eyes wide. "You have a castle," she said, a statement of pure fact. Clara's practiced smile softened into something more genuine. "It feels more like a very large library sometimes," she replied. "Do you like to read?" Maya nodded vigorously. "My dad reads to me every night. We're reading about a girl who can talk to animals." "That sounds like a wonderful story," Clara said, her gaze shifting to Leo, who remained silent, his hands resting uneasily in his lap. He was a fortress of his own, guarded and unyielding. The first course arrived, brought in by the same silent woman in the black dress. It was a delicate soup in a porcelain bowl, with a swirl of green herbs on top. Leo stared at it for a moment, unsure which of the 3 spoons laid out beside his plate was the correct one to use. He chose the smallest one, and took a careful sip. It was delicious, but the taste was lost in the tension that filled the air. "So," Clara began, leaning forward slightly, "you're a carpenter, I understand?" Leo nodded once. "I work with wood, yes. You build things that are meant to last," she said it. Not as a question, but as an observation. "I try to," he replied. His answers were short-clipped walls. He was building around himself. She could see them plain as day. "That's a rare skill, in a world that prizes the temporary," she mused more to herself. Then to him, the meal progressed in a similar fashion, a dance of polite questions and guarded answers. Clara asked about his work, about the town, about Maya's school. Leo answered, with a reserved civility, never offering more than what was asked. He was proud a man who would not be made to feel like a charity case or a curiosity in a billionaire's gilded cage. It was Maya who finally broke through the polite facade. She had been quietly eating her food, but her eyes kept darting around the room until they landed on a large oil painting on the far wall. It depicted a windswept coastline with a lone lighthouse standing against a stormy sky. "That's my favorite," Maya said, pointing with her spoon. "It looks like the ocean is telling a secret." Clara turned to look at the painting, and for the first time that evening her mask slipped completely. A flicker of genuine emotion, a deep and profound sadness crossed her face before she quickly composed herself. "It was my mother's favorite too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She said it reminded her that even in a storm, there's always a light somewhere." The air in the room shifted, then the polite distance between them collapsed into something more intimate, more real. Leo looked at her, at this woman, surrounded by immense wealth and palpable loneliness, and saw not a billionaire, but a person haunted by her own ghosts. He saw the truth of the painting, not as a work of art, but as a metaphor for the woman who owned it, a solitary light in a self-made storm. The rest of the dinner unfolded in a different key. The polished veneer had cracked, and what lay beneath was something far more interesting and vulnerable. Clara found herself speaking not as a host, but as a person. She talked about the paintings, not as assets, but as memories. She shared stories of her travels, not as a boast, but as a confession of her own rootlessness. She was a woman who had seen the world but had never found a place to anchor herself. Leo in turn began to lower his walls. He spoke of his wife, not with overt grief, but with a quiet reverence that filled the spaces between his words. He talked about the, quote, grain of different woods, as if they were old friends. Each with its own story and personality, he spoke of Maya with a love so fierce and tender. It was palpable in the air. Clara watched him mesmerized. She had spent her life surrounded by men who talked of power and influence, who measured their worth in numbers and acquisitions. Leo measured his worth in the things he could build, the love he could give, the integrity he could maintain. He was a man made of substance in a world she knew to be full of shadows after dessert. A delicate raspberry tart that Maya devoured with uninhibited joy. Clara suggested a walk in the gardens. Leo hesitated at first, but Maya's enthusiastic plea sealed his fate. They stepped out onto a stone terrace. The cool night air, a welcome relief from the stuffy formality of the dining room below them. A series of manicured gardens stretched out under the moonlight. A perfect silent world of sculpted hedges and sleeping flowers. They walked along a gravel path, Maya running ahead to chase fireflies that blinked in the darkness. Clara walked beside Leo, her hands tucked into the pockets of her dress. "She has your wife's spirit," Clara said quietly. It wasn't a guess. "How did you know?" Leo asked, his voice low. She looked at him. "I saw a picture in your wallet when you paid for the raffle ticket, a woman with bright eyes standing in a field of wildflowers. She looked like she belonged to the sun." Leo stopped walking, his throat tight. He had forgotten that picture was even there. A small, faded snapshot he carried like a secret talisman. "Her name was Sarah," he said softly. "She did belong to the sun." They stood in silence for a moment. The only sound, the crunch of Maya's footsteps on the path ahead. "I know what it's like to lose someone who was your anchor," Clara said, her voice laced with a sorrow that felt ancient. "This house, this fortune, it was all built by my father. He was a force of nature. But when he died, he left behind an empire and an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. I inherited his world, but I lost my own." For the first time, Leo saw her not as Clara Vance, the billionaire, but as Clara, the daughter. Survivor. He saw the weight she carried, the gilded cage she lived in, and he recognized the familiar shape of loneliness. He reached out his hand, not to touch her, but as a small, unconscious gesture of understanding. "It's a heavy thing to carry, alone," he said. She nodded, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "It is." And in that shared moment of vulnerability, under a sky full of stars, they were no longer a carpenter and a billionaire. They were just two people who understood the Bryant language of loss and the quiet, desperate search for a light in the storm. The drive home was a stark contrast to the ride there. The black sedan was just as silent, but the air inside was different. It was no longer thick with anxiety, but with a contemplative stillness. Leo stared out the window at the dark trees, rushing by his mind, replaying the evening the way Clara's laughter had sounded when Maya told a silly joke, the sadness in her eyes, when she spoke of her mother, the unexpected kinship he had felt standing beside her in the garden. He had walked into that mansion, expecting to feel small, judged, and out of place. And while he had felt all those things at first, something had shifted. He had gone in seeing a billionaire, and walked out seeing a person, a lonely person trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, but was navigating with a quiet grace he hadn't anticipated. Maya was asleep in the seat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, her breath soft, and even she clutched a small polished stone she'd found in the garden, a simple treasure from a world of unimaginable wealth. When they arrived back at their small apartment above the workshop, the world felt both the same and entirely different. The familiar smell of sawdust greeted them. The worn floorboards creaked under his feet, and the leaky roof was still there, a quiet reminder of his reality. But as he tucked Maya into bed, her face peaceful in the dim light, he felt a shift inside himself. He had spent 2 years building walls around his heart, convinced that closing himself off was the only way to protect what was left of his family. But tonight, a stranger had quietly found a crack in those walls, not by force, but by showing him her own. The following morning, Leo woke with a sense of purpose. He hadn't felt in months. He walked into his workshop not with the weight of his debts on his shoulders, but with a renewed energy, a clarity. He hadn't realized he'd lost. He looked at the unfinished jewelry box on his workbench, the one he hadn't been able to touch since Sarah's death. He picked up a piece of sandpaper and with a steady hand began to work. He sanded the edges, smoothing the wood until it felt like silk. He polished the mother-of-pearl star until it shone with a soft, ethereal light. He worked for hours, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of creation, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that slanted through the window. By the time he was finished, the box was a masterpiece, a small, perfect vessel of love and memory. A week passed without a word from Clara Vance. Leo didn't expect one, he told himself. That the dinner had been a one-time event, an anomaly, a brief intersection of two worlds that were never meant to collide. He threw himself back into his work, finishing the rocking horse for his neighbor, and starting on a new set of cabinets for the local bakery. He even managed to patch the leak in the roof, a small victory that felt monumental. He gave the finished jewelry box to Maya on her birthday. Her eyes lit up as she traced the star on the lid. "It's beautiful, Daddy," she whispered. "It looks like it holds secrets." He smiled. "It holds love. Kiddo, that's the best kind of secret." Life settled back into its familiar routine, a quiet rhythm of work, school, and the simple joys of a father and daughter navigating the world together. But Leo found himself thinking of Clara more often than he cared to admit. He'd see a storm cloud and remember the painting in her dining room. He'd see a firefly and remember her silhouette in the firefly subsime garden. He told himself it was just curiosity, a fleeting fascination with a world so different from his own. But deep down he knew it was more than that. She had seen him, not just the carpenter, not just the struggling single dad, but the man beneath it all. And in turn he had seen her. He wondered if she was still in that stone mansion staring out at the town from her gilded cage, or if she had disappeared back into the world of business and boardrooms, a ghost in her own life. He didn't. And he told himself it didn't matter, but it did. It mattered more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. Another week turned into 2. And the memory of the dinner at the Vance estate began to feel like a dream, a strange and beautiful story that had happened to someone else. Leo was in his workshop one afternoon, putting the finishing touches on a custom-built bookshelf for the town library, a project he'd taken on for a fraction of his usual fee, just because he believed in it. When he heard a soft knock on the workshop door, he wasn't expecting anyone. He wiped the sawdust from his hands and pulled the door open, his heart giving a sudden jolt when he saw who was standing on the other side. It was Clara. She was dressed, not in an elegant black dress, but in simple jeans, a soft gray sweater, and boots that looked like they had actually walked on gravel. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and without the armor of ponytail, her wealth, and her mansion. She looked younger, more approachable, more real. She held a small potted orchid in her hands, its delicate purple flowers, a stark contrast to the rustic wood of the workshop door. "Hi," she said, her voice little hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Leo stared at her for a moment, his mind struggling to form words. "No, not at all. Come in," he said, Stepping aside, she walked into the workshop, her eyes taking in the organized chaos of the space, the stacks of lumber, the scent of wood stain, the half-finished projects that stood like silent storytellers. She ran a hand over the smooth surface of the bookshelf he was working on. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "It's for the library," he said, finding his voice. "Their old one was falling apart." She nodded. "I heard they were raising funds for a new one. I'm glad they found the right person for the writer's job." She set the orchid down on a papal base. Clear space on his workbench. "This is for you. A thank you for the dinner, for everything." Leo looked at the flower, then back at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she said. She looked around. The workshop. Again, her gaze lingering on the tools, hanging neatly on the wall, the sketches pinned to a corkboard, the small worn-out radio that was playing a quiet classical station. "This place," she said almost to herself. "It feels alive." "It's messy," he countered with a small smile. "It's real," she replied, her eyes meeting his. And in that one word, the distance between them evaporated again. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. The music from the radio filling the radio, taps, space between them. Clara finally broke the quiet. "I was wondering," she began, nervously fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater. "I have this old writing desk. It was my mother's. It's been in storage for years, and it's in desperate need of repair. I was hoping you might take a look at it." Leo raised an eyebrow. "A writing desk." He knew this. That wasn't about a desk, it was an excuse. A bridge she was trying to build between their two worlds, and he found he didn't want to turn her away. "I can do that," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Bring it, by whenever you're ready." She let out a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, her relief palpable. "I will." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Leo," she said his name softly for the first time. "That night, in the garden, you were right. It is a heavy thing to carry alone." And with that, she was gone, leaving him with the scent of her perfume, a delicate orchid, and the undeniable feeling that something significant had just begun. The desk arrived the following Monday, delivered by two men in a pristine moving truck, who handled it with the reverence of a museum artifact. It was a beautiful piece, made of dark cherry wood, with intricate carvings and delicate brass hardware, but it was in a state of disrepair. One of the legs was loose, the finish was dull and scratched, and the drawers stuck. When you tried to open them, it was a project, a real one. A challenge that Leo welcomed with a craftsman's enthusiasm. He spent the next few days working on it, carefully disassembling it, cleaning each piece, and meticulously repairing the damage. He found a certain peace in the work, in bringing something old and forgotten back to life. It felt like he was doing more than just fixing a piece of furniture. He was mending something fragile and full of history. Clara started stopping by the workshop every afternoon, under the guise of checking on the desk's progress, but they both knew it was more than that. She would bring coffee, or pastries from the local bakery, and they would talk for hours. She'd sit on a stool in the corner watching him work, asking questions about the different types of wood, the tools he used, the stories behind the pieces he created. She was a quick study, a keen observer who seemed genuinely fascinated by his world. In turn, he learned about hers. Not the world of boardrooms and balance sheets, but the world of Clara, the person he learned about her childhood spent in boarding schools, her passion for classic literature, her secret love for old black and white movies. He discovered that beneath the polished exterior was a woman with a sharp wit, a curious mind, and a vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. One afternoon, as he was applying the final coat of polish to the desk, Clara was unusually quiet. She stared at the desk, her expression a mixture of sadness and nostalgia. "It looks just like it did when she used it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother would sit at this desk for hours, writing letters to her sister. She had the most beautiful handwriting, like music on a page. She traced the edge of the desk with her finger. After she died, my father couldn't bear to look at it, so he put it in storage. It's been there for 20 years. Leo stopped working and looked at her, his heart aching for the little girl who had lost her mother and the woman who was still carrying that loss. It's a beautiful way to remember her, he said softly. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It is. I just haven't had anyone to share it with. She looked at him, her eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion. Until now, he didn't know what to say. So, he did the only thing that felt right. He reached out and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was hesitant but warm, a silent offering of comfort. And in that moment, the space between them was no longer just about a desk or shared stories. It was about two people finding solace in each other's presence. Two people who were slowly learning to let their guards down and let someone else in as the days turned into weeks. The workshop became their sanctuary, a neutral ground where the labels of carpenter and billionaire ceased to exist. They were just Leo and Clara. Two people discovering a connection that was as unexpected as it was profound. Clara's visits became a regular part of Leo's routine, a bright spot in his day that he found himself looking forward to, with an eagerness that both surprised and scared him. She brought a lightness to the workshop, a sense of curiosity and wonder that had been missing for too long. Maya adored her. Clara would read her stories, help her with her art projects, and listen to her endless stream of chatter with a patience and genuine interest that warmed Leo's heart. He loved watching them together, the way Clara's composed facade would melt away, revealing a playful and tender side he never would have guessed existed. One sunny Saturday afternoon, they decided to take a break from the workshop and go for a hike in the nearby state park. It was a perfect autumn day. The air was crisp, and the leaves were a riot of red and gold. They walked along a narrow path, the sun filtering through the trees in dappled patterns. Maya ran ahead, chasing butterflies and collecting brightly colored leaves. Clara walked side by side, their shoulders, occasionally brushing a comfortable silence, settling between them. I haven't done this in years, Clara said, her voice full of a quiet contentment. Hiked? Leo asked. No, she said. Just this. Feeling of not having to be anywhere else, not having to be anyone else. They reached a scenic overlook that offered a breathtaking view of the valley. Below the town of Cedar Creek was a small patchwork of houses and trees nestled in the distance. They sat on a large boulder, sharing a thermos of hot apple cider that Clara had brought. It's beautiful from up here, she said. It's just a small town, Leo replied with a shrug. It's a community, she corrected. It's a place where people know each other, where they help each other, where a man can build a life with his own two hands. That's not small, Leo, that's everything. He looked at her, surprised by the passion in her voice. She met his gaze, her stormy, eyes clear and direct. You've built a good life here, Leo, a life full of love and integrity. You shouldn't ever think it's small. His heart swelled with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, a mixture of pride, gratitude, and a deep and growing affection for the woman sitting next to him. He had spent so long feeling like he was falling short, like he wasn't providing enough for Maya. But in that moment, sitting on a sun-warmed boulder with Clara by his side, he saw his life through her eyes. And for the first time, in a very long time, he felt like he was enough. The finished desk sat in the center of the workshop, gleaming under the overhead lights. It was a masterpiece, a testament to Leo's skill and dedication. The dark cherry wood shone with a deep, rich luster. The brass hardware had been polished to a brilliant shine, and the drawers slid open with a smooth, satisfying whisper. Clara stood before it, her hands clasped together, her expression a mixture of awe and reverence. "It's perfect, Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's more than I ever could have hoped for." "It was a pleasure to work on," he said, his voice full of a quiet pride. "It's a beautiful piece. With a beautiful story." She ran her hand over the smooth surface, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, turning to him, "not just for the desk, for everything." The air in the workshop was thick with unspoken emotions, the culmination of weeks of shared conversations, quiet moments, and the slow building of a connection that had taken them both by surprise. Clara knew this was more than just a business transaction, more than just gratitude for a job well done. It was a turning point, a moment where she had to decide what came next. "Leo," she began, her voice a little unsteady, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about my life, about the things I carry." He weighted his gaze, steady and patient. "I've spent so many years building walls around myself, thinking that was the only way to stay safe. But you've shown me that real strength isn't about keeping people out, it's about letting the right people in." She took a step closer, her eyes searching his. "I know our worlds are different. I know there are a million reasons why this shouldn't work. But I can't ignore what I feel when I'm with you. I feel seen. I feel real. I feel like I'm finally home." Leo's heart was pounding in his chest, a wild drumbeat against the quiet hum of the workshop. He had been so focused on his own fears, his own insecurities, that he hadn't allowed himself to consider what she might be feeling. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the raw honesty in her words, and he knew that this was a risk he had to take. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, "I feel it too." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and gently cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed against her soft skin, his calloused hands a stark contrast to her delicate features. "You're not just a client, you're not just a friend, you're something more." And then he kissed her. It was a kiss that was both hesitant and certain, gentle and passionate, a culmination of all the unspoken words and shared moments that had led them to this point. It was a kiss that tasted of sawdust and expensive perfume of hot apple cider, and shared sorrow of two broken hearts finding a way to heal together. It was a kiss that promised a new beginning, a future they would build together, one piece at a time. The news broke like a clap of thunder, on a clear day, a headline on a financial news website that sent ripples through the worlds of both business and the prosperous small town of Cedar Creek. Reclusive billionaire Clara Vance, rumored to be in a relationship with small-town carpenter. The article was accompanied by a grainy paparazzi photo of Leo and Clara leaving a local restaurant place. They had gone for a quiet dinner just a few nights before they were holding hands, their faces relaxed and happy, completely unaware that they were being watched. The story spread like wildfire, fueled by the public's insatiable curiosity about the enigmatic billionaire who had vanished from the public eye for months. The narrative was predictable, the stuff of tabloids and fairy tales, the wealthy heiress finding love with the humble, salt-of-the-earth craftsman. But the reality was far more complex and far more terrifying. For Leo and Clara, the intrusion was immediate. Clara's phone began ringing off the hook calls from her board members, her lawyers, her publicist, all demanding an explanation. Reporters began showing up in Cedar Creek, their cars lining the streets, their cameras pointed at Leo's workshop like vultures circling their prey. The quiet sanctuary they had built was suddenly under siege, their private world exposed to the harsh glare of public scrutiny. For Leo, it was a nightmare. He had always prided himself on his privacy, his ability to live a quiet life outside the noise of the world. Now, his name and face were being splashed across screens and pages, his life dissected. And judged by strangers, he felt a suffocating sense of powerlessness, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. The townspeople were a mixture of curious and protective. Some whispered behind their hands, their eyes full of a new kind of judgment. Others offered their support, their loyalty to Leo unwavering. But the damage was done. The delicate bubble they had created had burst, and they were left to navigate the wreckage. Clara was furious, not at the media. She was used to their invasive tactics, but at the world, for its inability to let her be happy. She saw the toll it was taking on Leo, the way he retreated into himself. His jaw constantly clenched, his eyes full of a familiar guardedness she had. "Worked so hard to break through. We can't let them do this to us," she said to him one evening, her voice fierce and determined. They were sitting in his workshop. The only place that still felt safe, the blinds drawn, the door locked. "It's not about them, Clara," he said, his voice tired and defeated. "It's about this," he gestured around the small workshop. "This is my life, my world. It's simple, it's quiet, and it's not built to withstand this kind of storm." "Then we'll build it stronger," she insisted. "We'll face it together." But he shook his head, his eyes full of a deep and profound sadness. "You don't understand," he said. "Your world, it doesn't just visit it, conquers it, changes everything it touches, and I can't lose this. I can't lose myself." The fear in his voice was a cold blade in her heart. She had been so focused on her own happiness, she hadn't fully considered the cost to him. She had brought the storm to his doorstep, and she didn't know how to make it go away. The pressure continued to mount, a relentless assault on their fragile new relationship. The media frenzy showed no signs of abating, and the contrast between their two worlds became more stark and painful with each passing day. Clara's board of directors summoned her to an emergency meeting in the city, a clear power play to remind her of her responsibilities, her obligations to the empire she had inherited. She left Cedar Creek with a heavy heart, promising Leo she would be back in a few days, but the city was a cold and unforgiving place. The boardroom was filled with men in expensive suits, their faces grim, their voices sharp. They spoke of stock prices and brand image of the damage her personal indiscretions were causing to the company's reputation. They presented her with an ultimatum, a choice between her personal life and her professional one, a choice she knew was no choice at all. Back in Cedar Creek, Leo was fighting his own battles. The reporters were more aggressive now, their questions more personal. They hounded him at the grocery store, at the gas station, at Maya's school. He tried to ignore them, to maintain his dignity, but their constant presence was a corrosive force, eating away at his peace of mind. The town was divided. Some saw him as a hero, a local boy who had captured the heart of a billionaire. Others saw him as an opportunist, a man who was out of his depth. The whispers and stares followed him. Everywhere, a constant reminder that his life was no longer his own. He retreated further into his workshop, the only place where he could find a semblance of control. He worked relentlessly, sanding and staining and building, his hands raw, his body exhausted, but his mind was a battlefield of fear and doubt. He loved Clara. He knew that with a certainty that was as solid as the wood beneath his hands, but he was beginning to fear that their love was a destructive force, a fire that would consume them both. When Clara returned to Cedar Creek, she found a different man than the one she had left. He was distant, guarded, his eyes holding a new layer of pain. The joy and lightness Clara returned to Cedar Creek had found together had been replaced by a heavy silence, a chasm of unspoken fears that seemed to grow wider with each passing moment. They tried to talk to bridge the distance, but the words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of the storm that was raging around them. They were two people from different worlds, caught in a current that was pulling them apart, and neither of them knew how to fight it. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of his workshop, the tension between them finally broke. "I can't do this, Clara," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. His back was to her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I can't live like this under a microscope. My life turned into a spectacle." Clara's heart shattered into a million pieces. "Leo, please don't say that," she pleaded, stepping toward him. "We can find a way." "There is no way," he said, turning to face her, his eyes filled with a desperate resignation. "This isn't just about the media. It's about who we are. You're a billionaire and I'm a carpenter. Our worlds were never meant to mix. They're like oil and water, they can't coexist." "That's not true," she cried, her voice cracking. "We were happy." "We were," he agreed, a sad smile touching his lips. "But it was a fantasy, a beautiful one. But it wasn't real life. This," he gestured to the world outside the workshop, "this is real life, and it's tearing us apart." He walked to the door and opened it. The cool, night air rushing in. "I think you should go, Clara," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Each word was a dagger in her heart. She stood there for a moment, her body trembling, her mind screaming in protest, but she saw the finality in his eyes, the deep and unwavering belief that this was the only way to protect them both. She walked out of the workshop without another word, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. Leo watched her go, the woman he loved, walking out of his life, because he was too afraid to fight for it. He sank to the floor, his body racked with a grief that was as profound as any he had ever known. He had chosen safety over love, and in doing so he had lost them both. The days that followed Clara's departure were a blur of hollow routines and a persistent, aching silence. Leo threw himself into his work with a desperate intensity, trying to drown his thoughts in the familiar rhythms of his craft. But the workshop had lost its magic. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a constant reminder of what he had lost. The scent of the orchid she had brought him still lingered in the air, a ghostly perfume of a love that had been too fragile for his world. He saw her, everywhere in the grain of the cherrywood desk he had restored for her, in the memory of her laughter echoing off the walls in the way the sunlight slanted through the windows, just as it had on the day he first kissed her. Maya was quiet, too. She didn't ask about Clara directly, but her drawings were filled with sad-eyed princesses and lonely castles. She would sit in the workshop for hours, watching her father work, her small face, a mask of confusion and sorrow. Leo's heart broke for her. Every time he looked at her, he had tried to protect her from pain. But in doing so, he had inflicted a new kind of wound, a wound of absence, a wound of unanswered questions. One afternoon, Maya came into the dollar workshop, holding the jewelry box he had made for her birthday. She opened the lid and stared at the mother-of-pearl star, her expression serious. "Daddy," she said, her voice small, "is this box for secrets or for memories?" Leo stopped his work and knelt beside her, his throat tight. "Both, I guess," he said. "Why?" "Because I think we have a memory we need to put in here," she said, looking up at him, her eyes full of a wisdom that was far beyond her years, the memory of Clara. His breath caught in his chest. He had been trying so hard to push that memory away, to bury it under a mountain of work and denial, but his daughter, in her infinite and innocent wisdom, knew that some memories were too precious to be discarded. She was right. He couldn't erase Clara from their lives. He couldn't pretend that their time together hadn't happened. It had been real, it had been beautiful, and it had changed him in ways he was only just beginning to understand. That night after Maya was asleep, Leo sat at his workbench and pulled out a piece of paper. He wrote a letter to Clara, a letter he had no intention of sending. It was a confession, a plea, a torrent of all the words he had been too afraid to say. He wrote about his fear, his pride, his regret. He wrote about how much he loved her, how much he missed her, how much he wished he had been brave enough to fight for them. He folded the letter and tucked it into the secret compartment of the jewelry box. A memory stored away, a truth acknowledged, a first step toward healing. Clara had retreated to her stone mansion on the hill, a self-imposed exile, from a world that had become too painful to navigate. She had cut off all contact with the outside world. Her phone was off, her emails unanswered. She spent her days wandering through the empty rooms of the house, her own personal ghost, in a museum of her family's legacy. She told herself that leaving Leo was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. She had brought chaos and pain into his quiet life, and the only way to fix it was to remove herself from the equation. But the logic of her decision offered no comfort. Her heart was to a hollow ache in her chest, a constant reminder of the love she had walked away from. One morning, she found herself in her mother's old library, a room she hadn't entered in years. The shelves were lined with books from floor to ceiling. A testament to her mother's love of literature, she ran her fingers over the leather-bound spines, her mind drifting back to a time when her life was simpler, when her heart was whole. She pulled a book from the shelf, a collection of poems by a poet her mother had admired. As she opened the book, a small folded piece of paper fell out. It was a letter written in her mother's elegant cursive, a letter she had never seen before. It was addressed to her father, dated just a few months before her mother's death. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words her mother wrote, of her love for her father, her joy in their life together. But she also wrote of her fears, her insecurities, her feeling of being overshadowed by his larger-than-life personality. She wrote of the importance of fighting for love, of not letting fear or pride or the opinions of others dictate the course of your heart. The letter ended with a line that struck Clara like a bolt of lightning. True love is not the absence of storms, but the courage to weather them together. The words were a message from the past, a gift from her mother, a beacon of light in the darkness of her despair. She had been so focused on protecting Leo from the storm, she hadn't realized that he might be strong enough to weather it with her. She had let her fear make the decision for her, and in doing so she had dishonored the very love she was trying to protect. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back. She had to fight for him, for them, for the chance to build a life together, a life that was strong enough to withstand any storm. Leo was in his workshop, sanding the leg of a chair, when he heard the familiar sound of a car pulling up outside. His heart leaped into his throat, a wild hope that he quickly tried to suppress. He told himself it was just a customer, a delivery, a mistake. But when the workshop door opened and Clara stood there, his carefully constructed walls of denial crumbled into dust. She was dressed in a simple white dress. Her hair was down, her eyes were clear and determined. She looked like an angel, an avenging angel, come to reclaim what was hers. Clara. He breathed, his voice a mixture of shock and relief. I thought you were gone. I was, she said, stepping into the workshop, but I came back. She walked toward him, her gaze never leaving his. I made a mistake, Leo, a terrible one. I let fear dictate my actions. I let the world convince me that our love was a liability, but I was wrong. She stopped, just in front of him, her hands reaching up to cup his face. Our love is not a liability. It's a strength. It's the most real and beautiful thing in my life, and I'm not going to let it go without a fight. Leo's eyes filled with tears. He had been so lost in his own fear he hadn't considered that she might be fighting her own battles, that she might be just as scared as he was. He reached up and covered her hands with his calloused fingers a stark contrast to her smooth skin. I was scared too, he admitted, his voice choked with emotion. I was so afraid of losing you, of losing everything, that I pushed you away. It was the stupidest thing I've ever done. We were both stupid, she said, a small smile touching her lips. But we can be smart now, we can be brave now. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was filled with all the pain and longing and regret of the past few weeks. But it was also a kiss of hope, of forgiveness, of a second chance. It was a promise to weather the storms together, to build a love that was stronger than any force that tried to tear them apart. They stood in the workshop, wrapped in each other's arms. The promise to Vacation 254 and www. Scent of sawdust and orchids mingling in the air, a perfect fusion of their two worlds, a testament to the fact that love, when it is true and real, can conquer anything. The storm had not passed, but they were no longer afraid. They had each crossed other, and that was all the shelter they would ever need. In the weeks that followed their reconciliation, Leo and Clara began the slow and deliberate process of building a new life together, a life that was a fusion of their two worlds. Testament to their love and resilience. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The media frenzy hadn't completely disappeared, and the challenges of their different backgrounds were still very real. But they faced them together with a newfound courage and a deep and unwavering commitment to each other. Clara made a bold move. She called a press conference, not in a stuffy boardroom, but in the heart of Cedar Creek in the town square, with the community gathered around her. She spoke not as a billionaire or a CEO, but as a woman in love. She spoke of Leo with a pride and reverence that silenced the most cynical of reporters. She spoke of his integrity, his kindness, his quiet strength. She told the world that he was not a story or a spectacle, but the man who had taught her the meaning of home. She announced that she was stepping back from the day-to-day operations of her company, placing it in the hands of a trusted team so that she could focus on what truly mattered: her family, her community, and the life she was building with Leo. It was a powerful statement, a declaration of her priorities, a clear message to the world that she would no longer be defined by her wealth or her name. Leo stood by her side, his hand holding hers, his presence a silent testament to their united front. He was no longer the scared and guarded man who had retreated into the shadows. He was a man who had found his courage in the love of a woman who had dared to see him for who he truly was. Together, they began to weave their lives together. Clara bought a small farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place with a wraparound porch and a field of wildflowers that reminded her of the picture in Leo's wallet. She filled it not with expensive art and cold furniture, but with warmth and laughter and the simple joys of a family. She and Leo worked side by side to restore it, he with his skilled hands and she with her keen eye for design. It became their sanctuary, a haven from the outside world, a place where they could just be Leo and Clara. Maya thrived in their new life. She had the love and stability of a two-parent home, a mother figure who cherished her and a father who was happier and more at peace than she had ever seen him. The workshop expanded. Leo took on an apprentice, a young man from the town who shared his passion for woodworking, and together they created beautiful pieces of furniture that were a fusion of Leo's rustic craftsmanship and Clara's modern aesthetic. Their work became sought after, a symbol of the beauty that could be created when two different worlds collided. The final piece of their new life fell into place. On a warm summer evening, a year after they had first met, they were married in the wildflower field behind their farmhouse, surrounded by their friends and family. From both of their worlds, it was a simple ceremony, filled with love, laughter, and the quiet promise of a future that was as bright and beautiful as the setting sun. As they stood on the porch of their farmhouse watching Maya chase fireflies in the twilight, Leo wrapped his arms around Clara and pulled her close. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. She leaned back and looked up at him, her eyes shining with a happiness that was deep and true. "I love you too," she replied. "We weathered the storm," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "No," she said, a smile playing on her lips. "We became the storm." And in that perfect moment, they knew that their love was not just a story of two people from different worlds finding each other. It was a story of two people who had built their own world together. A world where love was the only currency that mattered. A world where a carpenter and a billionaire could find their happily ever after. Not in a castle on a hill, but in a small farmhouse with a leaky roof and a field of wildflowers.